What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my two-part video series on painting the Hulkbuster suit. There are a number of great tutorials already out on YouTube going step by step through painting each of the different parts, and I don't think it's good value to actually go through painting each individual part of the Hulkbuster. Not that it wouldn't be informative, but I think that what I want to do with this video series is arm you with both a practical but also a theoretical knowledge on how to break down, thinking through how to properly paint a full metal object like the Hulkbuster. Rather than just tell you to put a highlight here and a shadow here, I want to explain why we're putting highlights and shadows where we do, and hopefully this will better equip you to then look at another model that has a lot of non-metal metal. And without even having a video tutorial on that, you can take this theoretical knowledge and begin to apply it to your own painting and grow your understanding of how to paint these complex miniatures. So part one of this video series is going to be the practical. I'm going to talk through the different color recipes that I use for painting this Hulkbuster miniature, and I'll demonstrate them on different parts of the model. And then part two of this series is going to dive into the theoretical side. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of the fundamental shapes, how we're dealing with light, how it travels, and then the materiality of an object and how it impacts not just how it's showing lights and shadows, but how it reflects. And this is really important for looking at metallic objects or metallic surfaces as secondary light sources. I'll then take a breakdown and look at Hulkbuster and how we apply this theoretical knowledge on this miniature and think through some of the more complex parts and shapes of this model. So before we can start diving into the theory of painting non-metal metal and breaking it down using our Hulkbuster miniature, there are a couple of fundamental things or a couple of theoretical foundational things that we need to talk about first before we can proceed to the miniature. So there's three things I want to cover in this video. I'm not going to deep dive too much into them now. I do have a video that I've uploaded to my channel. You can go check that out, where I talk about sort of these three things, or at least the first two, in greater detail. So the first is fundamental shapes. So everything in nature can essentially be broken down into four fundamental shapes. That's the cube, the sphere, the cylinder, and the cone. Now, that's not to say that everything in object is just these four shapes exclusively, but you're going to see that if you really break it down, everything in nature is actually made up of a combination of these four shapes, or have facets or features or parts where you can take how light and shadow behave on these four shapes and then apply it to whatever object it is you're analyzing. And I do encourage you take some time to really look at things around you throughout your day-to-day life and start to consider where the light source is coming from, how it's illuminating that object, what sort of surfaces and shapes is that object actually made out of, and then try and break it down into these four different shapes. So again, the cube, the sphere, the cylinder, and the cone. So you can see here a very rudimentary sort of way of shading these four shapes. And this is sort of how most people or most miniature painters tend to want to illustrate and shade their figures accordingly. So you have your light source, which in this instance is the sun. And then you're going to shade each one with your brightest highlight on the side of the surface that's directly facing towards wherever the light source is coming from. And then as you curve around, you get darker and darker and darker until the side that is directly opposite is the darkest. And then you can sort of suggest the volume or the form of the shape. For example, on the sphere, you're going to start curving your shading to simulate the roundness of the shape. Right? On the cylinder, you're going to curve sort of your shading to simulate the roundness of this cylinder. The cube is relatively straightforward when it comes to shading flat planes. The more direct the plane is facing towards your light source, so the more perpendicular it is, the brighter the highlight is going to be, and the more away facing it is, the darker it's going to be. And it can be easy to think of the way it's illustrated here, where a sphere is essentially made up of lots and lots of little flat planes. A cone or a cylinder is made up of a lot of flat planes that just curve away and away and away. And the more planes or the more transition steps that you add, the smoother it is. So this cone and this cylinder, the way that it's shaded, it kind of suggests not like a hexagonal shape, but that each sort of facet of the curve is a very distinct plane. But if you start getting into more complex shading, you start to really smooth out your blends, you can suggest a very a smoothness to the actual surface of the object. So the more transition gradients you add between, the smoother you make your transitions, the more rounded the surface actually is. And this is where we start to dive into the complexity of not just having a primary light source, but we're dealing now with reflected light. So you can see here that this manner of illustration is much more complex because now you're just not considering one light source where you're going to have your brights and your darks, but there's going to be something that's directly opposite of your light source or some other light source entirely, whether it's another object, say a local light, or some sort of plane beside it that's actually reflecting something that's now pushing more highlights onto whatever shape it is that you are trying to shade. The theory is no different. These reflected lights are essentially secondary light sources, and you're going to treat considering the highlights and the shadows in exactly the same way as this drawing. Where this is a very simplified version where there is no reflected light. So you imagine that there is, say, the vast infinite emptiness of space around it. When the sun would illuminate, say, this planet, there literally would be nothing behind it because there is nothing to reflect. There's no stars, there's just empty void. And this kind of shading would hold true. But the moment that you put in, for example, let's say this sphere is sitting on a table. We can suggest that with the shadow. The table itself is now going to be receiving whatever light is coming from your primary light source, which we're just going to say for simplicity is the sun. It's not going to hit this table, and it's not going to bounce. It's going to bounce in all manner of direction, including back onto our shape, in this case, the sphere. What we're going to see now is this table now acts as a light source. It's reflecting a highlight on, and much like in this way where we have a light to dark shade, we get something similar, only now at the halfway point, the terminator point, where you have your light side and your primary light source and your reflected light meeting. You get your terminator, this deep shadow line right in between. So something that's really, really important to consider when we're now dealing with both primary and secondary or reflected light sources is we're dealing with this deep shadow line that isn't exactly in the furthest back where we might expect it to be in a more simplistic way of rendering, but it's actually somewhere in the middle where these two sort of sides meet, from your main light source and your reflected light source. And the strength of this reflected light is entirely dependent on what is reflecting that light itself. Now, that's important to keep in mind when we get to Hulkbuster, because we're not going to be dealing with metallic surfaces that are fairly reflective. And again, I don't want to deep dive too much into it in this video, just for brevity. I encourage you to take the time to actually Google reference images. Don't try and find other illustrations, although it can help. Try and find photographs of real life objects. If you're familiar with 3D programs and you can model it yourself, model these four shapes in a 3D environment, play around with placing light sources in different places, closer or further away, different strengths, and put objects around whatever it is you're analyzing, and take a look at how light behaves. You're going to find that you're going to start seeing these little things, these terminator lines where your deepest shadow is, reflected light happening that's creating the soft glow in the back, primary light source creating your bright light side in the front. There are a couple of important things to keep in mind insofar as just your values. Everything on the light side that's being lit by your primary light source is always going to be brighter than everything on the shadow side, which is everything that sits on the opposite side of this terminator. So in this shape, this area right here is your light side divided by your terminator, which is your deepest shadow, and then you have your shadow side on the back, which is being lit by your reflected light. So all the values here are always going to be darker than any value here, which means that your brightest highlight in the shadow side is still always going to be darker than the darkest value on your light side. Also consider that reflected light is always darker in value than the actual source of light itself, regardless of what that source is. Important to consider again when we're talking about reflected light and local objects or objects immediately adjacent in the local vicinity of your shape, creating those reflections. And once you understand sort of these basic core concepts in terms of your light side, your terminator, and your shadow star, and you start to understand how reflected light and primary light starts to create these different nuances within your shading, it's not a large step to jump into shading these objects as if they were metal. I'll talk about materiality in a second just in terms of reflectivity, but essentially when you start to think about these four fundamental shapes being metallic as opposed to non-metallic, like a plastic or a fabric, if they're actually made of metal, they're going to be much more sensitive to light. They're going to be much more reflective, and you're going to start to see exaggerations in terms of your value gaps. Your brights and your darks are going to have much starker differences, and especially depending on how reflective the material is and how close or far away your light source is, you're going to start to see much more shifts between your light and your dark, and much more of them, especially on flat surfaces. So for example, when we're looking at this 3D cube, I know this is a bad example because it is a rendered object and not a real cube. I think this one is fairly straightforward, fairly good. Notice how quickly the value jumps from your dark to your bright. Where something like this, it might be much softer. This is slightly more metallic because of how sharp this highlight is. It almost suggests it's kind of a metal cube. But this one could be plastic. You see how soft this highlight is, and even though that this part of the cube is so much further away from the bottom, that shift in value really isn't that great. When we start getting into metal, for example, it starts to become very different. Let me see if I can find a good example here that's flat on the ground. You see here how there's so much more information on the cubes, how this ground is creating this very stark highlight, and then we're suggesting a slight roundness to the edge because of the way this curves, and how this dark value, this dark corner right here, is so much darker than everything in between. Right? So when we're looking at metal shapes, this gap between values is really, really important to sell the difference between painting something like metal versus plastic. And then the more reflective the metal is, the more of these shifts you're going to see. And especially when we start looking into the spheres, the cylinders, and the cones, these highlights and these shadows, these jumps become very, very apparent. Right? We start seeing these very sudden shifts depending on how reflective the object is, where a light source is coming from, are there multiple light sources, what's creating these reflections. And it's important to incorporate that into our painting, that metal, or painting metal, is all about incorporating these value jumps, these bright brights and these dark darks, and putting them side by side to really sell that reflectivity. Same thing here with the cylinder, we start seeing very strong bands of lights and darks. It's not just a soft, bright, dark shade now. We now start seeing bands based on how reflective it is. Up into chrome, we start seeing heavy bands. Okay? And I know that a cylinder and a cone, I think, are two distinct shapes, just in terms of like a fundamental understanding, but really they're both the same. A cone is essentially a cylinder that tapers to a point. You can taper it to a round or whatever, but it functions the same. You have what is essentially a light, a dark shade, but because it goes to a point, your bands are now angular. They're triangular bands that travel across. Right? You can see here, if we were to take all this to a point and squeeze it, instead of being a rectangular plane, it's now a triangular plane. We just take that to an infinite complexity for a round object. And again, with a metallic cone, it's no different. We just start seeing more distinct bands based on how reflective the material is and the impact of our primary light source and our reflected light. The second fundamental theory that we need to talk about is the fact that light always travels in straight lines. It doesn't bend, it doesn't curve, it always goes straight. This is important to think through when we're talking about a complex thing like the Hulkbuster that's entirely non-metal metal, where every surface is essentially acting as a secondary light source. When that light travels and bounces, it'll always go in a straight line, and you have to consider how different objects or different planes may overlap or intersect. And especially when we start talking about object source lighting, when we're painting the arc reactor on Hulkbuster's chest, on his palms, on his feet, the glow of his eyes. How is light reflecting off of those and impacting the areas around? And we'll talk about it on the Hulkbuster helmet as a really good example, where the light that's emanating from the eyes should not be glowing on the planes on the outside. Why? Because those panels are directly facing away. They're nowhere near any sort of perpendicularity to the actual eye lenses themselves, and so they're not going to be receiving any reflected light at all from that source. And then the third is materiality. And I don't want to deep dive into sort of the science behind the way that our eyes perceive light. I think it's important enough at a basic fundamental level to know or to understand that everything we see is light, or more importantly, it's light reflecting or bouncing off of an object. Light is essentially made up of a spectrum. You have your Roy G. Biv colors, and then you have your infrared and your ultraviolet, things that we can't see. But what we can see, the visible spectrum, is that red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and sort of everything in between. And so when we look at an object and we see its color, what we're actually seeing is that particular wavelength reflecting off of an object and being bounced off into our eyes. Put another way, what we're not seeing is that object absorbing the wavelength of every other color. So if we were to consider, for example, Iron Man, his red armor, assuming it's not metal, it's just red armor, all plastic, I don't know, whatever fabric. When our eyes see that red, what we're seeing is all of that red light wavelength being reflected off of the armor and then bounced off and received into our eyes. And then the armor itself is absorbing every other color wavelength. That orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, that's all being absorbed. When we then have to consider talking about materiality, different materials reflect light in different ways and in different amounts. And this is important to consider when we're painting non-metal metal, because metallic objects are much more reflective. And the more reflective the metallic is, so when we're starting to go from like a more brushed or matte metal, pushing further into chrome as we get more and more reflective to something that's purely reflective like a mirror, more of that light is going to be bounced into our eyes that we're going to be seeing. And that means that's more information that our eyes are able to pick up and that we're going to see in the surface of that armor. So when we're painting metallic objects, think about the materiality of the metal. How reflective is it? And knowing that will determine how sharp or soft your highlights are going to be and how defined those highlight and shadow shapes on the armor are going to be. So if you were to, for example, look at something like brushed metal. Brushed metal sits more on the low end of reflectivity. We still see those bright values, those bright highlights, as well as those dark shadows that is indicative of a metallic shape. But the actual details of what's being reflected, where that light source is coming from, objects around, tend to be much softer. So if we're painting something that's a brushed metal look, we're not going to be worried too much about the specific reflections that we're painting. We're mainly looking at our brights and our darks and how to contrast the two to sell that metal look. if we were to look at something like chrome, for example, chrome becomes highly reflective, and it starts to really reflect sort of a more clear definition or a clearer reflection of objects in its immediate surrounding. Because it's reflecting more of that information more clearly and more crisply, we have to start to consider, okay, well, what object is creating this reflection, that's creating this bounce light, and how much of it do I have to define? Am I going to have to start painting definitive shapes in the armor, things like if it's his foot armor on the Hulkbuster, for example, reflecting some of that sidewalk pavement. If his leg is chrome, am I going to have to paint a lot of that sidewalk detail? How much of that detail you paint in helps to determine how reflective your material is. Right up until you get to painting something like a mirror surface or a mirror finish where you're reflecting everything perfectly. So once we understand sort of that basic fundamental knowledge of those four basic shapes and how we're going to have to start thinking about the materiality of the object and sort of how reflective or how matte the metal may be, how does this sort of apply to painting the Hulkbuster, and how are we thinking through each of these things? Well, taking the cube as an example, right? A cube is essentially an understanding of how flat planes interact with light. Essentially, if we were to take this phone, for example, and imagine this flat surface. And this is my light source here with the brush tip. The more direct this facing is towards the light source, the brighter it is. The more we turn away, the darker it gets until it's facing away, and then it's receiving none of it. And at that point, it's going to be receiving the light from the table, which is my secondary source. And now we're going to think it again, but in reverse, where this is now my light source, creating reflections onto this flat plane. So on the Hulkbuster, really, any flat surface, we're looking at the chest panels here, these abs, these thigh plates, the forearm plates right here. These are essentially flat surfaces. Now, they do have a bit of a curve to them, and so you can think of both the combination of a flat surface or a very, very large cylinder. So if you imagine this curve carried out to its full size, a circle all the way around, well, how would a cylinder behave there, right? You may argue that if there's a bit of a curve here, well, now we're starting to get into sort of a sphere shape where we start to get a highlight focus point. On the top plate, for example, here, it's not just a flat plane, but there is a slight curve to it. So we can start to incorporate the knowledge of both a cylinder and a sphere in terms of how we're going to get spots of highlight, or maybe even bands of highlight as it curves around, right? On this abdomen plate, at its core, I'm thinking first, okay, well, they're flat surfaces, so how direct are these planes facing towards my light source? If my light source is coming 3/4 top down right here from the direction of his face, well, this panel faces fairly directly, and so it's going to be bright. This one, it's fairly indirect, almost not quite parallel to the light source, but close enough, so it's going to be like a mid-dark tone. This is not facing at all, so it's in pure shadow. I then start to consider the curve of this, and so I'm thinking, okay, well, it's a cylinder. So as I get my way down, each of these individual lines, if you think of them as planes on a cylinder, remember that very crude rudimentary drawing of a cylinder where it's just rectangular planes going down the curve? Well, we're going to get darker and darker and darker as we curve away from our primary light source. So we get that nice bright to dark transition. Once we've considered sort of that primary light source, we now start to think secondary light sources. Okay, well, for this abdomen plate, for example, now that I've considered where my main highlights and shadows are based on my primary light source, what about the metallic pieces around creating reflections? So I start to think about this belt. How reflective is the belt? Well, fairly, if you look at the references. I will get to the references sort of later on, but we're going to consider the gold fairly reflective. And so we start to consider, okay, well, how much of this belt is creating a reflection on the abdomen plate? Well, the only thing that we're really getting here is sort of this corner edge and maybe this inset, but this inset on the inside of the belt really isn't getting a lot of direct highlight from my primary light source. The angle's fairly far away, going to be fairly dark, and so the reflected light that it's creating is going to be fairly dark as well. And so what I've done is I've added a sort of soft highlight right here that's just a touch darker in value than this part. And you can see I've incorporated that line all the way through and all the way down. I don't carry that in the back here because as we get in, this curve of the belt actually receives no light. And so we're not getting any reflection here. And this can be a little complex if both objects, for example, are reflecting into each other. You're going to get some light bouncing back and forth that helps you reinforce it or reinforce highlights and shadows into each other. But that also gives you a bit of wiggle room or a bit of leeway to sort of fudge the values based on what you think looks good. And you can afford to not be super precise. This is an art after all. We're not looking to just verbatim be super accurate. Artistic license and creativity goes a long way in terms of sort of fudging some of these details. If you're not exactly comfortable, get the broad strokes, and I think everything else will sort of just fit in. If you were to start to consider objects are maybe more cylindrical, for example, you look at his arms, right? At the core of it, each of these arm sections is just a giant cylinder. This arm is a cylinder. The bicep here is a cylinder. Even this abdomen plate that runs all the way around is essentially a cylinder. It's got some details in there, some undulations, it tapers, but it's essentially a tube that runs all the way around. So when we start to consider highlights as they behave on cylindrical objects, and you can see fairly clearly on this forearm how we start to see these bands, right? We start to get these bright and dark bands, sort of based on the facing relative to the light source. Sculpted onto the forearm right here is a sharp corner. And so I've incorporated a sort of fairly bright to a mid-tone jump. Sell that reflectivity there. Remember, brights and darks side by side. Another band here. And then basically, as we get into our shadow area, our terminator, we have our darkest shadow right here before we start to wrap around into our reflected light. I imagine there's some object here in the distance behind the Hulkbuster that's creating some reflections, and so I'm getting a lot of reflected light in the back. But I don't want it to be too close. So my reflected light here isn't terribly strong. It's not going to really brighten this back area too much until we get around to where the gauntlet is. Now the gauntlet, gold, fairly reflective, remember, catching some stronger reflected light from behind. It's going to create some reflections right adjacent to the red armor. So we incorporate some extra highlights here. And then the complexity in, for example, the forearm here. Really, this is no more different than considering, okay, well, now it's a cylinder and we've incorporated some planes, much like a cube. Well, we already understand how to light a cube and how to think through lights and shadows on a flat plane, or even a flat plane with a slight curve to it. So we can incorporate that knowledge and now carry it through. So for example, here, this flat plane, we're catching the light from this direction. And so we get this brightest spot right here. But as we curve around to our terminator and then into the back, it gets darker and darker and darker until we get some reflections in the back. Where we start to get into some complexity, especially on areas like the leg. Well, even before that, right? Carrying on our understanding of cylinders and cones and how they might combine, take a look at the feet. At the core of it, the feet is essentially a cylinder. And we can see that with these bands of brights and darks. And as it tapers to an almost point at the boot, we start to incorporate the idea of a cone, where these highlights now begin to taper in and center in into the tip of the boot here. However, our primary light source isn't coming from this direction. It's coming from top down. It's shining down and catching this part of the boot because this plane is the most direct facing towards the light source. And we have to consider, okay, well, it's going to be brightest here, and we're just going to fade, right? We might catch some edges right here, So we get a little brighter there before getting back into shadow. And as the boot curves up, it hits a really flat plane that's receiving no shadow, or no highlight, sorry. Put it in shadow before it angles again and is fairly direct facing towards the light source, so it gets brighter. So where we get into some complexity sort of in terms of shapes on this figure is areas like the greaves. How do they call the greaves? These parts right here. Because what these are essentially cylinders combined with spheres or something spherical like. And we're also dealing now with concavity. So everything we talked about so far in terms of spheres, cylinders, and cones, they bulge out. Well, what happens when they bulge in, right? If you look at the boot, this surface curves out, much like a sphere would. When it reaches this point, as it curves around, it's like a cylinder, but then it curves and flares out again. Well, in instances like this, you can start to think through, okay, well, we understand a cylinder has these bands of highlights. So we start to incorporate or introduce these bands of lights and shadows based on where our primary light source is and then reflected light. And then as we get into our spherical area where it starts to round out, we now start to round out our highlights as well, much like we would a sphere. We have our brightest point right here where it's catching some sort of reflected light and it's getting into shadow. When you start to get into like areas where you're not sure of, check references. Go on Google and look up metallic concave objects. You can even look at objects in real life. Try and find maybe a towel rack that you have, or maybe something in your shower, for example. Those handlebars or the shower spouts or whatever. Even the shower handle you have might have some concavity to it. They're typically metal. And depending on whether it's a matte or a polished metal surface, you can really start to look at and analyze those kinds of everyday shapes to try and understand, well, okay, I can literally see in real life and I can manipulate this object based on where I'm positioning my light, how close, how far it is, and objects around. I can understand how this object now behaves with this light and shadow, and I can begin to apply it. And really all that happens is with concave things, it starts to flare out. It tapers in at the deepest part and then flares out. So you can see this highlight as I bring down, tapers to nothing in the dark area, because as the sphere, I'm sort of treating this curve right here as the terminator. So you can sort of just see it very subtly carries across, intersecting with spherical highlights, or cylinder highlights. And as we flare out, we get these bands that increase, sort of like a reverse cone. It gets brighter and brighter, right? And I think from there, really, that's about how. And I think in a nutshell, really, that's just sort of the most complex part of painting this figure is the mental gymnastics you have to go through in terms of thinking through your light and shadow, not just from your primary light source, but from your reflected lights. Because this armor, every surface is metallic, based on how reflective it is, you need to consider each plane or surface of this armor as a light source in and of itself. How reflective is that surface? Knowing that determines how much light is being bounced off it to create a reflective light source, which then dictates how bright you're illuminating objects around it to create these secondary highlights. And I think this reaches the height of complexity in areas like right here on the legs where they have the two side by side. Thankfully, there's no gold in between, apart from maybe here, but because it's mostly in shadow, not super reflective. If you check the references through all the Iron Man films, the red actually isn't hyper reflective in terms of local color or local highlights. So you can get away with sort of having a lot more of a subdued reflected light that's happening from red armor bouncing on red armor. What you do need to consider stronger reflected light is gold or the silver reflecting onto the red. The gold and silver on the Iron Man armors tend to be much more chrome-like, much more reflective, and so you're going to catch a lot more of those highlights and those shadows as reflections. So I try and capture that, for example, right here on the forearm, where I have this strong highlight reflecting off of the gold forearm band. I try and capture that here in the silver. And then right here as well, where the gold bounces off, I try and capture some more strong reflected light here, from here on the inside. Right here in the engines, you get some reflected light from the gold happening here. Just little things like that. All right, another strong band right here reflecting off of the gold. On the fingers as well, because we're getting the light reflecting here, you might see or might want to put in some stronger highlights here. And when all that's said and done, at the end of the day, because this is a miniature that's based on almost a decade's worth of films where they've created 3D models and they've done the effort, they've spent the time to render the armor in all sorts of different environments and lighting conditions. If you're ever not sure, look at references. Just Google the Hulkbuster, Google the Iron Man. If you want, go frame by frame in the different films and just look at his armor, look at how it interacts with sort of different lighting situations, whether it's daylight, nighttime, is it outside, inside, what kinds of objects are around him. Start to consider the sort of the source material and use that as a jumping point for informing your decisions on how to light and shade this Hulkbuster miniature. So I hope this video isn't too rambling. I hope there was a lot of insight that you were able to get from it that you can then take and apply to painting your own Hulkbuster miniature. If you want to check out the actual recipes and the technique for painting the specific colors on Hulkbuster, I recommend you check out the other video, the part 1 to this part 2, where I cover the actual technical aspects of painting the model. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll make sure I drop links in the video description below. And as always, until next time, happy hobbying.